I want to thank my Patreon supporters for helping make videos like this possible. Last night, while cruising through the internet, I came across the trailer for a new movie entitled Yesterday. The film is directed by Danny Boyle and is set to release in June 2019. Judging from the trailer, the film is a fantasy comedy that employs a Twilight Zone-like motif to tell the story of Jack Malik, a struggling musician in England who, after a mysterious incident, wakes up one day to discover that no one on the planet Earth remembers the Beatles or their music except him.
Now it looks as though they're here to stay. Oh, I believe in yesterday.
When did you write that?
I didn't write it. Paul McCartney wrote it. The Beatles.
Who?
And judging from the trailer, the film looks like a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to seeing it. But this trailer does bring up some very interesting cultural questions that I'm sure that this movie itself is probably not going to explore. What if the Beatles never happened? And what exactly would the impact on our modern culture be? Think about this for a moment. The Beatles' appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1964 is considered by many as a moment that inspired a generation of youngsters to pick up the guitar and or bass or get behind the drums and start a band. Within rock and pop history, there is a whole roster of famous musical names who point to this event as the seminal, influential moment that changed their lives. What if this had never happened? Would the history of classic rock be as big as it is without this moment that inspired so many to start making music? Would we even have half the amount of legendary classic rock that we do now? But also, when you think about the enormous influence that the music of the Beatles has had over the last 50 years or so, both directly and indirectly, you have to wonder how different the musical landscape might have been had they never happened. Now you might think, well, that's impossible. The Beatles would have just had to have happened. But I would beg to differ. Many years ago, I had an idea for a fictional story that would explore this idea. Tell me if you've heard this before. A time traveler goes back in time and accidentally changes history. It's been done plenty of times, but usually in these kinds of stories, the change in history is earth-shattering. Nazi Germany winning World War II is a perfect example. So I thought to myself, what if our time traveler changes history, but instead of some big cataclysmic event, the world loses something culturally important instead? To me, one very sad cultural loss would be the music of the Beatles. Now, if you follow this channel, you know that I love the music of the Beatles. But as much as I do love their music, I feel pretty certain that if they had never happened, the world would probably get along pretty much more or less the same without them. But culturally, it would be a terrible loss. And the sad part is that we wouldn't even know it. In my story, only the time traveler remembers the hits of the Beatles, but he isn't a musician, so he has no way to communicate their music to anyone except maybe to hum a few bars, and he isn't much of a singer. He realizes that he's done the world a cultural disservice, and he travels to England in the present day to try to find out what happened. To his surprise, he discovers that Paul McCartney is living a quiet, mostly anonymous life in England. He finds him and asks him about his youth. McCartney tells him that yes, in his youth, he did once play in a band with a couple of friends he grew up with. There was John, George, and Pete. When he asks him about Ringo, Paul searches his memory for a bit and says, "Who?" In this altered history, the Beatles never met Ringo because of some little thing that our time traveler did that set off a series of events. I hadn't worked out that part of the story yet, but timing and chance is such a fickle thing that there could be all kinds of reasons why this happened. The time traveler asks Paul what happened to his band, and he tells him that the band had some heat for a while, but that eventually it faded. They couldn't get any record label interest, and then one of them had to move on when his girlfriend got pregnant. And well, life just happened, and that eventually it fell apart. I figured my time traveler would probably ask Paul if he still kept in touch with any of his old bandmates, and that Paul would respond by saying that he hadn't heard from George and Pete in ages. And then he'd add that sadly, John died in a car accident, not too long after it all fell apart. I used a time traveler for my story, but I have seen this scenario play out in real life, minus the time traveler, of course. Over the years, I have witnessed a number of really great local bands and singer-songwriters who showed great promise. They recorded a great demo, but they just couldn't get the breaks. And after a while, life interferes and throws a curveball, and the whole thing just splinters and falls apart. We oftentimes think that bands break up because of drugs and egos, because this is so much more dramatic. And while that does happen, I have also found that bands break up simply because life just happened. And unfortunately, luck doesn't happen. George Martin once stated that when he was introduced to the Beatles by Brian Epstein, that he was not aware of the fact that every other label in England had already turned them down, and that had he known this, he might have refused to meet them. It was lucky for the Beatles that he didn't know this. But what if he had caught word of it? He might have refused to meet them, and musical history could have been very different. Yes, it's possible that the Beatles might have still found success somewhere else, but without George Martin to act as their producer, how different do you think their musical trajectory might have been? I envision my story as a small, quiet tragedy. The world loses something culturally important and doesn't even realize it. And our time traveler has no way to set things right again. I figured it would make a nice short story or even a nice short teleplay, but certainly not a movie. Like I said earlier, I don't expect the movie Yesterday to explore any of this, but I am expecting it to be an enjoyable fantasy comedy. It did get me thinking, though, about that story that I never wrote, and the question that it made me ask. What if the Beatles never happened? And by the way, the Beatles aren't the only ones that you can ask this question about. What if Elvis never happened? How different might the culture be without the impact that he made? What if Shakespeare never happened? What if Mozart never happened? The list goes on and on. Anyway, I'm looking forward to seeing the movie Yesterday, and who knows, maybe there's more to this movie than what we are led to believe by its trailer. Perhaps it will ask deeper questions than it lets on. Hi, this is TJR. If you like this video, please be sure to click like, click subscribe, and also click the bell notifications icon so you can know when I release new videos. And if you'd like to help me make more videos, please go to my Patreon page at patreon.com/TJRTheOriginal and make a monthly pledge. Pledging as little as the cost of 1 cup of coffee a month can make a huge difference. Patreon supporters get access to exclusive early content, and it's also the best way to suggest a video topic. And even if you can't become a patron supporter at this time, I still want to say thank you for watching the video, and I look forward to checking out your comments.